Question again, this is for an audience also in France. In 2022, India moved into 5th place in terms of the size of its economy. Of course, this received quite a lot of attention, both within and without India. And I'd just like your opinion about how significant is this? Can India see this as a sign that its economy is on some way in a healthy position? And then maybe if you just want to say a word about what you see as the key strengths, but also the key weaknesses. And if you'll mention just a word about the demographic dividend, because that's another aspect that outside India, there's a lot of interest in.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Loraine. So I think India being the 5th largest economy in the world in terms of GDP is not a particularly interesting fact because it's mainly a reflection of the large size of the population. I mean, the per capita GDP is still very, very low. India is still a very poor country in international perspective, despite fairly rapid growth over a period of time. Just to give an idea to your audience, since they may not all be familiar with the facts, the last consumption expenditure survey was carried out in 2011-12. And according to an analysis of that data by the IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, at that time, almost half of the rural population would not have been able to afford a nutritious diet, even if it spent all its income on food. And if you make a small allowance of $50 a day, which is nothing, for non-food expenditure, then 2/3 of the population would not be able to afford a nutritious diet. That's the kind of levels of poverty we're talking about. The proportion of underweight children is higher in India than in virtually any other country in the world, except one or two, like Niger in Africa or something. So it's still a very poor country. Of course, living conditions have improved, in the last 20, 30, 40 years. I'm not denying that, but the absolute levels of living conditions are still very low. Now, the GDP, the aggregate GDP being so large, that can be important depending on your objective. I mean, if you're interested in people's living conditions, then you should look at per capita GDP and not total GDP, and then you would find that India is a very poor country. If your objective is to be a power in the world, then of course, aggregate GDP is important. I mean, it enables you, for example, to have a big army, it enables you to have weight in international forums and so on and so forth. And that is very important for the Indian elite, I think. I mean, I think they want to become what they call a Vishwaguru, a world leader. So I think for them, it's very important that the GDP is so large. But I think if you're talking of living conditions, if you're talking of development, it's not necessarily a good thing to be such a large country. In fact, probably it makes things difficult. If you're interested in democracy, it may not make things easier either. You asked me about the weaknesses. I think the main weakness, which goes back all the way to the 1940s and 50s, is the neglect of human development and human capabilities and human resources. We have been writing about this for many years. India really failed to ensure adequate schooling, adequate healthcare, adequate nutrition for its population, and is paying a very big price for it. I referred to the stagnation of real wages. I think it has a lot to do with the existence of this huge reserve army of people who don't have many skills that are valued in the modern economy. They may have a lot of skills of their own. They may know how to do all kinds of things like build houses and grow crops and so on and so forth. But skills that enable them to do well in the modern economy is a different matter. So I think that is really India's big failure, and it continues. That's why I referred to the schooling crisis during COVID and the fact that we're not paying any attention to that today. The demographic dividend, I'm afraid, is more or less behind us, so far as I know. If you look at the dependency, the demographic dependency ratio, that is the ratio of children and old people as a proportion of the adult working age population. It has come down quite a lot in the last 20 years, but it's not expected to decline much more, if at all, in the near future. So that demographic dividend, I think, is largely behind us. What could make a big difference is a major increase in the workforce participation of women, which is extremely low in India. It's one of the lowest in the world if you exclude a few countries in Western Asia. And there's a huge potential for many, many more millions of women to join the workforce. And it could be a good thing for them and also for the country and for the society. It could bring a lot of change in the society, especially if the working conditions are reasonably good. But there's no sign of it happening at the moment. In fact, if anything, it may have been in the other direction in recent years. So we are waiting for that to happen. I think eventually it will happen, at least to some substantial extent, but it's not happening yet.
My next question is about how the social security system in the past 2 decades has worked, because India has made a significant progress in laying the foundations of it, of a good social security system. And what are the main elements of this social security system and its further progress being made at the moment, according to you?
So I think I have mentioned the main elements. I think there are 5 big ones. I mean, one is the Rural Employment Guarantee Act. One is the public distribution system, basically the subsidized food rations, and then social security pensions for elderly persons, widows, and disabled persons, maternity benefits under the National Food Security Act, and child nutrition programs. I think these are the big things. Of course, you can add other things as well. But I think if those work well and if the benefits are increased, and most of them are based on universal principles, they're not necessarily 100% universal, but near universal. And I think mostly they work reasonably well by now. I think the main exception, partial exception, I would say, is the Employment Guarantee Act. I think you're right to say that there are still a lot of problems, in fact, maybe growing problems in some respects. The Employment Guarantee Act, in my view, is an experience of tremendous importance for the entire world. And it's really a historic initiative. And the fact that India has demonstrated the possibility and sustainability of an employment guarantee program on a large scale for almost 20 years, I think that really gives us hope for the entire world. I used to think that it may be difficult to have similar programs in other countries because in India, the wages are low. And I thought that's what makes this feasible. But that's not true. I mean, if you look at the real wage as a proportion of per capita GDP, it's more or less the same in India and in France or Germany. On top of that, in France and Germany, when a person is unemployed, you give them quite a lot of money in unemployment benefits. So if you want to give them a job instead, you just have to pay the difference between the minimum wage and the unemployment benefits. And that's not necessarily very large. So I think it's an idea that is affordable in many countries. And that, in fact, is beginning to interest many countries. And I would like to hope that it will make some headway around the world, because the social costs of unemployment are enormous. I mean, we should really not tolerate this. And it's been around for decades on a big scale all over the world. So we have to try to find a way out of it. And this is at least partly a way out, hopefully. I think in India itself, the Employment Guarantee Act proved its mettle in a big way during the COVID crisis, when, you know, in 2020, either 20 or 21, almost, in fact, a little more than 100 million people got some work under the Employment Guarantee Act, not full-time work, but they got some days of employment over the year. And I think that combined with the subsidized food rations really played a terribly important role in helping people to avoid the worst during that crisis. I would also mention, still on a positive note before I come to the problems, that the better works done under the Employment Guarantee Act are quite impressive. I mean, even in Jharkhand, where I live, which is one of the states where the program is least well implemented, even there are some very, very interesting projects. For example, almost 100,000 wells were built, and the wells are actually quite well. You must have seen them. I can see that you're nodding. They are quite well built because, you know, people have traditional skills of building wells, so they know how to do it without an engineer. They have an incentive to do it well because it's for them, it's for their own land. And then once the well is built, they can grow much more lucrative or nutritious crops like vegetables and so on. And we have seen that effect, and we have some studies that also show that the financial rates of return, forget the social rates of return, but even just the financial rates of return on these projects are very high. Same more recently with mango plantations. I have a student who looked at the financial returns on mango plantations under NREGA, and it's extraordinary how high they are. And you might say that, well, if they are so high, then why were people not growing mango trees earlier? And it's not so difficult to understand because the investment costs are quite high. It's a bit risky, and it requires a lot of knowledge. But through a program like NREGA, you can provide these inputs and help people to make this investment, which is so productive. Now, having said that, there are problems, certainly. I think there are two related problems that are causing serious difficulties and really have to be resolved somehow. One is the persistent failure of the central government to ensure timely and reliable payment of wages. The workers have a right of payment within 15 days, but mostly it doesn't happen. And not only are they often not paid for months, but sometimes they're not paid at all because of glitches in the system. And that has a destructive effect on the entire program because it has the effect of discouraging the workers. And then when they lose interest, the program collapses because the entire program is supposed to be based on the active participation of workers at every step. And the reason why this has happened is that the payment system keeps being changed every 1 or 2 years. You know, it began with cash, then post office, then banks, then one particular bank, then the so-called FMS, EFMS, NEFMS, other payment-based system, then different payment orders for different caste groups like SC, ST, and others getting different payment orders, which is utterly absurd. And now a new system based on digital attendance, which is going to be even more problematic. And every time you rejig the system, there are so-called teething problems for months or years. And by the time they are resolved, the problem is changed again. So this really should stop. And the central government should put in place a reliable and timely payment system. The second problem is corruption. Now, there had been quite a lot of progress in reducing corruption in NREGA in the initial years. In fact, by 2011-12, I would say that wholesale corruption had been largely eliminated. In the sense, by wholesale corruption, I mean, for example, fake muster rolls, like the entire muster roll, the entire worker attendance sheet being manufactured. That had largely disappeared. There were still cases of fake names of workers and so on, but not wholesale corruption. Unfortunately, during the last few years, we have seen a return of some of these practices. This is a long story, but to cut a long story short, the government, first of all, there has been enormous centralization in the program and a blind faith in technology. So everything now is digitized. It gives an impression of transparency because the person in Delhi can see everything on their computer screen. But the workers themselves are completely in the dark. They don't see anything anymore. The system has become so complicated that you need a middleman now to implement. You have to involve these contractors who are not supposed to be there. And they know how to game the system, because all you have to do now to siphon off money from that program is to meet the online submission requirements. That's not very difficult to do. I mean, you just have to capture the data entry operator and the local Gram Rozya Sevak, the local employment officer at the Gram Panchayat level. And then between the three of you, you can manufacture these online records and siphon off money. So I think we have to return to more participatory means of fighting corruption, like, for example, payment in public. Payment in public is, quite effective, because you can see the crooks if they try to siphon off money.